And without that, and without further ado, let's get to why we're here, to learn from great experts who are doing the work to figure these diseases out. And we're going to begin with my friend and colleague, Dr. Elizabeth Head. Liz got her Ph.D. as well as her master's in pathology and neuroscience at the University of Toronto. She actually completed her training by doing a postdoctoral fellowship right here at UC Irvine. She went on to begin her faculty academic career at the University of Kentucky, where she was wildly successful. And gratefully, we were able to steal her back to join the faculty here at UC Irvine just a few years ago. She's now professor and vice chair in the Department of Pathology and Laboratory Medicine at the UCI School of Medicine. Liz is incredibly productive. She's published more than 200 peer-reviewed manuscripts. She's leading numerous efforts in UCI MIND, in the UCI Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, in the School of Medicine. She has her own center devoted to the study of aging and Down syndrome. She's a fantastic contributor to the field as a whole and to everything going on at UCI MIND, and she's also a delightful colleague and a sought-after collaborator. She is going to talk to us today about work that's been going on at UC Irvine for decades, and that she and her colleagues are really spearheading and leading for the nation and the globe now. And that, of course, is the relationship between Down syndrome and Alzheimer's disease. Liz?
Good morning, everyone. I love seeing faces for a change. It's so nice to be in person. And I'm delighted to give this talk about aging and Alzheimer's disease in people with Down syndrome. And I talked about this before in this forum many, many, many years ago, so some of this might be a little bit familiar, but there's a lot of new updates, which I hope will excite you. So I'll cover a couple of topics today. I'm going to do kind of a 30,000-foot level for the most part, and then near the end, I'm going to dive down a little deeper just to show you what we're doing in the lab. So I'll talk about what is Down syndrome and what causes it, and what is the link between Down syndrome and Alzheimer's disease. What does Alzheimer's disease look like in people with Down syndrome? What treatments do we have available? And that's where some of the good and the bad news kind of pops up and where we can have some really active discussion later. And why is it so critically important, particularly for people with Down syndrome, to use this lifespan approach? And I'll show you there's a lot of things happening for people with Down syndrome, even when they're children and growing into young adults. There's lots of stuff across the lifespan that are targetable and that also translate out to everybody. And then how can we prevent Alzheimer's disease in people with Down syndrome? And that question, actually, I'm going to save for discussion, because I have some ideas, but I'd like to hear your ideas as well when we get to that part. And I'll tell you a little bit about the Alzheimer's Biomarker Consortium for Down syndrome, which UCI plays a strong leadership role in, and it's an international effort. So Down syndrome, just kind of get us all on the same page, was first described in 1887. It is the most common cause of intellectual disability, and we estimate there's just under 500,000 people in the United States who are living with Down syndrome, and the numbers, of course, are substantially larger around the world. Now, the most common cause of Down syndrome, and there's actually 3 causes that you can ask me about later, but the most common that accounts for about 95% of people is this extra copy of the smallest chromosome, chromosome number 21. And this was discovered in 1959 by Lejeune and Gautier. And the good news about this being the smallest chromosome, and this is why this is a survivable chromosomal condition, is there's fewer numbers of genes on this chromosome, which means as a scientist and a researcher, it's a lot easier for me to think about which genes could be contributing to both risk of developing Alzheimer's disease, but also what could protect against Alzheimer's disease. So there's good and bad news on chromosome 21. Some proteins are good and some are not so good. So the good news for people with Down syndrome and their families is that they are living longer. So compared to 1970, people with Down syndrome didn't live much past 15 years of age. And part of that was due to a lot of congenital heart problems that were not being corrected, which are now corrected all the time. But now we have folks with Down syndrome living up until their early 70s. And that's not just medical care, that's the whole lifestyle of being integrated into society, going to school, working, getting married, getting divorced. they're living all those fun things, and that is extending their lives. Now, the most rapidly growing population of people with Down syndrome are those who are between 40 and 49 years of age. That's the size, that population is growing faster than any other age group. And those numbers, keep that number 40 in your head. That's going to come back later. It's an important number for people with Down syndrome. So, what is the link between Alzheimer's disease and Down syndrome? And why is it so important, I think, as a community that we continue to work with people with Down syndrome to help them? As you all know, Alzheimer's disease was first described in 1906, and it is associated with changes in cognition that eventually lead to changes in function and activities of daily living. And we know that that person has had Alzheimer's disease when we look at the brains of our brain donors, and we see plaques and tangles in the brain in sufficient numbers to meet the criteria for a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. And I'm spending a little time on that for a reason that will come up in a minute. So let's talk about plaques just for a second. This is, I promise, the only molecular bio really you're gonna see, and it's pretty easy stuff. But plaques are made up of a protein called beta amyloid. And this beta amyloid protein on this little cartoon is this long squiggly protein. It's very, very big. And it sits kind of in the membranes of both neurons and inside of neurons. And that long peptide gets cut into smaller pieces. And in fact, some of the scissors that do this job are ones that have mutations that can cause familial Alzheimer's disease. So this is really an important kind of pathway. And these scissors go and cut up the long amyloid precursor protein to make these beta amyloid peptides. They're very sticky, they love each other, and they form plaques. And eventually what you see in this picture here, which is a stain for plaques in the brain of a person who died with Alzheimer's disease, they form these big clusters of plaques. Now you can probably figure out why I'm dwelling on this a little bit, because when you look at the genes on chromosome 21, one of the key genes that's on there is the amyloid precursor protein. So everybody with Down syndrome is making 1.5 times more amyloid precursor protein, which means they're making more beta amyloid protein even before they're born. And this is where some really interesting questions about resilience and protection can come in. So then when you look at people with Down syndrome and our amazing brain donors, and you look for plaque pathology in their brains at different ages, what's really interesting, and not good news obviously for people with Down syndrome, but as researchers, this is really helpful. When we see plaques is very, very age dependent. So the earliest times we see plaques are in people in their 30s who have Down syndrome. Those plaques get progressively worse at 40, and at 54, they just there's more and more plaques build up over time with age. And by the time a person with Down syndrome is 40, they not only have plaques, but they also have the neurofibrillary tangles, which is the second piece you need for this diagnosis. So everybody with full trisomy 21 will have Alzheimer's disease neuropathology in their brains by the time they're 40. So if you kind of back up a little bit, this is something we can leverage because we don't know the age of onset for Alzheimer's in the general population. It can be 65 up to 100. So if you're trying to think about prevention studies, it's very challenging and you need lots and lots of people to participate. For people with Down syndrome, we know that in their 30s, that's when things start. So if we wanted to do a prevention study, we probably want to go in their 20s, or certainly in the early 30s to kind of prevent things from happening. So my dream is in the future, and you'll see how we're trying to prepare for that, is we're going to be able to do prevention studies for people with Down syndrome. And what I hope we learn from these wonderful people is going to translate out to everybody. And so that's my grand vision for a lot of this work. All right, so you may have the question, how do we diagnose dementia in people with Down syndrome? We do have a background of intellectual disability. So all of the standard tests that you're used to seeing or administering or being administered to will not work for people with Down syndrome. And so we have to use a different set of tasks that takes advantage of their abilities, and we can still assess memory ability, learning ability, executive function, visual spatial skills. They're just slightly different, but they get at the same type of function in the brain. And then we administer these tests to our participants or a person reporting with problems. But we also have to take into account, just like everybody, what's going on around them. So are there co-occurring illnesses, of which there are several that are pretty frequent for people with Down syndrome, that are contributing to a change in cognition? Are there changes in the living situation? People might be moving out of the home into group homes or vice versa, or moving to live with a brother instead of the sister and the mother and the father. Lots of things can be really stressful for people with Down syndrome and can lead to an apparent cognitive change. And there could be additional external factors like the pandemic, which had a huge impact in people with Down syndrome since they became very socially isolated, and it caused a lot of depression and a lot of change in these cohorts. And there's a nice paper published about this too. So we take a look at all of these things together, and if we have longitudinal data, if we have seen them for a couple of visits, then we can look for change. And change, of course, just like with everybody, is your biggest signal that things are not going in the right direction. So we see a decline. And then our clinicians meet with our neuropsychologists, our imagers, our biomarker people, and we can do a consensus discussion. So we all agree this person definitely has mild cognitive impairment or early dementia, or they're cognitively stable. And so this is how we diagnose dementia in people with Down syndrome. All right, so given that, and actually I'll back up one, given that you all know now that people with Down syndrome have Alzheimer's disease pathology by the time they're 40 years of age, when do you think they might show the earliest signs of dementia? So 20 to 30, raise your hand if you think that's when you might see changes. Okay. 30 to 40. Good. 40 to 50. All right. 50 to 60. Great. All right. I'll tell you the answer. The answer is it's typically in their 50s that they would show signs of decline. So on the panel on the left, what you're looking at is 3 cohort studies that across age. And let me just use my pointer here. So on the x-axis is age and the percent of people affected by dementia. And this is all in 3 different groups of people with Down syndrome. And what's interesting is up until about 50, it's pretty stable. The numbers don't change much. But after 50, everything kind of explodes. And that incidence goes up, that prevalence goes up rapidly. But note, even in the oldest people with Down syndrome, there's a proportion of people, about 10 to 15%, that don't develop dementia, which is absolutely fascinating. And then consistently, cohort study after cohort study over the past 5 years, between 52 and 53 years of age is the median age of onset, but look at this variability. There's some people that develop earlier in their 40s, and some people who don't develop dementia until their late 60s. But nonetheless, there's some really cohesive information here that helps us in designing future clinical trials. All right, so how do we treat dementia in people with Down syndrome? And as many of you are aware, there are the standard treatments that we use for the general population focused on anticholinesterase, and we also have the new Aduhelm vaccine. And these different drugs will work well for some people for a period of time. They work well in different stages of the disease. They do have some side effects associated with them, which can be overcome. So when we look at the clinical data for people with Down syndrome, look to see if there's actual clinical trials for people with Down syndrome with these drugs. These studies have been very, very small and very, very disappointing. So memantine has failed for people with Down syndrome. Thankfully, no increase in frequency of adverse effects. A study with donepezil showed a modest and or really no effect on cognition and lots of adverse events. There's only been one tiny study of Exelon, which did not even look at efficacy. Tacrin, there's been no studies, and galantamine, there's been no studies. So the take-home message is there is no evidence that the currently approved drugs to treat Alzheimer's disease will work for people with Down syndrome. However, that doesn't mean we shouldn't try, because some people still will respond well. But that tells you we have some very clear needs, that we need to focus on this cohort of people who are highly vulnerable to this disease. And typically, people with Down syndrome are excluded from clinical trials. They're an underserved population of people. And we really need to figure out what treatments would work best for people with Down syndrome, and importantly, when and how should we target these treatments. And this is where the lifespan approach becomes critical. So here's an example of how my brain works. I see this as a kind of pieces of a puzzle. So if we just put everything that I've been talking about in context of aging from birth all the way over to 60 years of age, we know that that extra copy of chromosome 21 is there before birth. We know plaques kick in the 30s, tangles in the 40s, and dementia in the 50s, okay? So what we want to do as a lab is back this up and try to fill in some of the pieces of what things are happening in the brain so that we can figure out what treatments we should be considering. And one of the things that we've been focusing on, because this has been such a hot topic for everybody with Alzheimer's disease who is at risk, is cerebrovascular pathology or blood vessel pathology in your brain. And people with Down syndrome have some very interesting protective factors at play, as well as factors that might drive this pathology. And this includes they typically don't develop atherosclerosis and they don't develop hypertension. On the other hand, they are prone to being overweight and obese, partly because of hypothyroidism, and they have a high frequency of sleep apnea because of the structure of the throat and the tongue. And because they make too much beta amyloid, there's some of that sticks to the blood vessels. It's not just in plaques. And this is what it looks like. So in this image here, you can see a plaque, but you can also see these long squiggly lines. Those are blood vessels that are covered in this beta amyloid peptide. And those blood vessels are not able to constrict and dilate properly, and they become leaky. So this is obviously a big problem. And it was interesting, there wasn't a lot of effort in this area for people with Down syndrome because everybody thought they would be protected, but it turns out they're affected worse than people who do not have Down syndrome. So if we just look at the frequency of when we see this pathology on the blood vessels with age, the probability of having none drops with age, and the probability of having blood vessel pathology increases dramatically with age. And it looks like it's around after 46 years. What happens when you have these blood vessels that can't constrict and dilate, become brittle? We see microbleeds in the brain. So in this image, a beautiful study by Alex Hellman, she was able to look at some of the brains of our donors and look for blood vessels and stain with this blue stain that shows you where bleeds have happened in the brain. And she counted all of these in a huge study. It's our dissertation work, so poor thing had to do all this work. We can look at just normal aging, and then the number of microbleeds we see in the brain between people who are young, middle-aged, and old. And we see a slight increase, but it's really just individual people showing, scattered little microbleeds. These microbleeds could have happened from falling off your bike when you were 6, or they could have happened the day before you passed away. That's kind of the cool thing about this stain. When we look at sporadic AD, not surprisingly, we see lots of bleeds in the brain. When we look at people with Down syndrome who do not have Alzheimer's disease pathology, we don't see very many bleeds. And now when we look at people with Down syndrome of Alzheimer's, we see an equivalent number of bleeds in their brains, slightly higher. But also keep in mind, these people are 20 years younger than those with sporadic Alzheimer's disease. So this is a big problem. And what we're going to do now is look at, count these bleeds in people with Down syndrome using in vivo techniques or MR imaging, where we can see lots of little bleeds, these dark spots here. We can count those up and we can figure out how big they are. And that will be a study we're going to do in a larger cohort with Adam Brickman at Columbia University and with Dr. Lisi Flores Aguilar, who's a postdoc in my lab, who's also being supported by Kelly Poon, who's an undergraduate student. All right, so I'm going to just very quickly expand on this because we're getting near the end of time, but again, this lifespan approach. So now I can add in, where do I see vascular pathology between 40 and 50? So you can imagine I can keep building these pieces. What happens after we see blood vessel pathology? We see brain inflammation. What happens before we see plaques and tangles and bleeds? We see changes in the brain's connectivity. And in people with Down syndrome, which is very unique, they have another kind of inflammation in their brains when they're young that becomes worse with age. So that means we have to be really careful with these folks to consider side effects on treatments that we're going to be developing, because this is one place where they're different. Everything else, they seem to be pretty much the same. And I have this wonderful group of graduate students and postdocs who are working on different aspects to the problem. For example, Ellie Andrews is looking at the biological effects of sex. What difference is there between men and women with Down syndrome? Menopause happens 6 to 7 years earlier in women with Down syndrome. How does that drive some of these effects? Dr. Lorena Sordo is looking at obesity and the role of leptin in driving pathology. Jeremy Rouenet is looking at fluid biomarkers that helps us predict when people are going to develop pathology. And Cherie Stringer is looking at more of this inflammation, looking at astrocytes specifically to see where do pathologies in that cell type contribute to Alzheimer's disease development. So the implications are, when we kind of put this all together, is there, and I've covered A-beta, beta amyloid plaques, tau pathology, cerebrovascular pathology. These are all potential targets for interventions later in the disease. And it means also for people with Down syndrome, we might, at different ages of that person, target different things. So if a person is 30, we might want to target plaques, but not necessarily tangles. If they're in their 40s, we need to think about targeting both. And if they're in their 50s, we need to target inflammation, plaques, cerebrovascular. It gets more and more complicated, obviously, but that's the situation. Our brains are complex. This is not a single piece in this puzzle. So as I mentioned, this is why I think we have a really good opportunity for prevention, but we need to also figure out what are the best outcome measures to use for a clinical trial. And in the last minute or so, I'll tell you about this one study that we have going on, and spread the word. We're always looking for people to participate. And this is called the Alzheimer's Biomarker Consortium for Down syndrome. We lovingly call this ABCDS. And there's 4 leaders on this program, Ben Handon at the University of Pittsburgh, Brad Christian at Wisconsin University, and here at UCI, Mark Mapstone and myself are the leads. This study, which you can find on the NIH website, because the NIH actually actively participates in this program by coming to all our meetings. We are recruiting 550 people with Down syndrome over 25 years of age at 18 different clinical research sites. One's in the United Kingdom, in Cambridge. And just like our ADRC does and clinical trials do, we bring people in on a regular basis, assess cognition, we do a lot of neuroimaging, and for those folks who are willing, we also do brain donation and neuropathology outcome measures. And there are a number of other big longitudinal studies that have geared up that is getting the whole community poised for clinical trials for people with Down syndrome. The Trial Ready Cohort for Down syndrome run by Mike Raffi at USC. The LUMIND has the Life DSR study that is also recruiting people. And Down Syndrome Connect, which is this beautiful kind of huge database that people voluntarily enter information, not quite like C2C, but close, are all getting poised and ready. So that as soon as we figure out what the best course of action is, we're going to jump. So let me just end by saying that my work is inspired by collaborating with a lot of different and wonderful people. Most importantly, I always want to thank my participants, their families, and especially for the talk I gave today, brain donation was a critical piece for us to understand what treatments we need to consider and develop. I have a fabulous UCI team here, and I mentioned Dr. Mark Mapstone. And of course, all of the data I show you is never generated by me. It's by the real researchers who are the graduate students and postdocs in the lab. And here's a wonderful picture of our crew doing a painting together. So with that, I would like to thank you, and I'm open for discussion.
Great talk, Liz. Great talk, Liz. We're going to open up for questions. There were 2 in the chat. I think one was more for me, and it was that the DSM, the updated DSM, does not use the term dementia. It uses a major neurocognitive disorder, and why was I not adjusting appropriately? And the answer is that there's a lot of important work around nomenclature, how we refer to the conditions we study, and the reason I use dementia is because I wanted everybody to know what I was talking about. And you know, this will be a process, and I think next year we'll try to have a talk on this very topic because it is really important. We want to avoid otherizing terminologies, but you know, these things take time. The other question, Liz, was from one of our statistical colleagues, and it was, in your plots of dementia incidence or prevalence, how did you address time of death, age of death?
Probably this was, so I can't answer that question well, and boy, you got to get scared when a statistician asks you a statistical question.
You know you're in trouble.
So I would have to go and pull out that paper and look to see how they did those different studies. And I believe time of death was considered, certainly in the more recent studies, the one graph that had 3 lines was a meta-analysis of existing cohort studies. So the simple answer is I don't know, and the second simple answer is probably, and I would love to get you the paper so you can tell me how to answer that properly next time.
Dr. Nan, calling Dr. Nan. I'm not seeing, so we have one more in the chat. Can early dementia be seen in patients with autism?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm asked a lot about autism, and I was starting to do a little research into that. People with Down syndrome have a higher prevalence of autism, so that's another thing that can confound things. My understanding so far, there was one small study suggesting that people with autism were at a little higher risk for Alzheimer's disease, and I think there's just very little work on this right now. But other studies I've read don't seem to show any additional risk for people who have autism. So I think the jury is out, but I know there's wonderful groups working on this because it's critically important, especially for people with little ones with autism trying to plan for the future, like those with Down syndrome.
All right, we'll go to the audience.
Thank you. I'm Dr. Pete Moran. I work with Alzheimer's disease. I use a functional medicine approach. And what we have found out, which I believe, is that inflammation plays a big part in this. And what brings to mind is what's going on with the trisomy 21, where there is a propensity for inflammation. And as we know, inflammation occurs throughout the whole body, just not in one location. So what's triggering off these cytokines?
I could talk to you for hours about this because it's absolutely my favorite topic. The inflammation that we see in the brains of people with Down syndrome are kind of twofold. There's kind of a childhood kind of inflammation in their brain, and then there's a later one. And the later kind of inflammation might be driven a bit by the fact that we're seeing bleeds in the brain, so proteins in the blood are getting into the brain when they shouldn't be there, and that's causing inflammation. There's also a huge interest in peripheral inflammation and how it's driving brain inflammation. So here's one example. People with Down syndrome have a higher prevalence of periodontal disease, which is an inflammatory disease. And there's a couple of clinicians in our team who are trying to understand, is that part of the risk that drives earlier onset in some of our folks? So, and when we think about clinical trials, some of the treatments that we might be considering might increase inflammation as a side effect to some extent, and that's something we want to be a little careful of. So I think certainly for Down syndrome, there's at least half a dozen or a dozen genes on chromosome 21 related to inflammation that also drives the process. So it's a big deal. It's an excellent question and something we should look at.
One more from the audience here.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kim Bailey, and I'm with Alzheimer's Orange County. And we do some work in this area, including a support group for caregivers that we co-sponsor with UCI MIND. And it seems to me one of the inherent challenges that we're facing is how to educate young families on preventative techniques, since those measures have to be put into place, pretty much at birth. So we need to educate them to treat the coexisting conditions. We need to help them reduce things like obesity, hypothyroidism, all of the things, exercising, all these things that they should be doing. But our challenge is that they just don't want to hear about Alzheimer's early on. So my prayer is that we can overcome that and help them to strengthen the lifestyle factors in order to help prevent that onset of Alzheimer's. Thank you.
And actually, I want to throw out kudos to Kim Bailey for the amazing support group that she's running. Our families desperately need it. I couldn't agree more, and some of the talks I give, and I give talks for the Down syndrome associations and to families, is all about prevention and lifestyle modification. And there's a couple of key co-occurring illnesses in people with Down syndrome that, frankly, if not controlled or managed, will cause cognitive problems. Vitamin D deficiency is another frequent thing. Hypothyroidism, sleep apnea, oh my gosh. Sleep apnea alone, if we can control that, will reduce risk or push off the age of onset. And exercise, social, those are all terrific for the brain. And this is why I think we're seeing people with Down syndrome live longer. So now what we need to do is catch up with the quality of life piece to this. So thank you for that. Thank you for doing that. And I'm hoping more and more younger families are more open to talking about it. And I'm getting a lot more queries from people with little ones which makes me really happy that they're thinking about it and planning. Because I think by the time a 6-year-old with Down syndrome now will grow into 30s and 40s, we'll be so ahead of the game on understanding ways to prevent. So this is the time.
Great. Thank you, Liz.
Thank you.